Well, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today here on the YouTube Revival Center page. It's always a pleasure for you to join us today here on this live stream. We call this the Influence, so if you have not liked this video, please like it real quick. Hit that subscribe button. It is our way to get the influence out there in the TV world. So thank you so much for joining us. If you would like to jump in the comment sections, you can. If you're watching this live, Aaron Limbaugh is here with us, and you can jump on there and communicate with him. But today's subject is, could Jesus have sinned? Could Jesus have sinned? Now, again, this is a debatable topic based upon which theologian you talk to and which theologian you read. So there are two sides to this interesting question. It is important to remember that this is not a question of whether Jesus sinned or not. That's not the question, because both sides of this as the Bible clearly states that Jesus did not sin. But that's not the question, did Jesus sin? Everybody agrees he did not sin. The question is, could Jesus have sinned? So there are two theological words that describe the two different sides of this point of view. Those who hold to the impeccability believe that Jesus could not have sinned. Those who hold to the peccability believe that Jesus could have sinned but did not sin. Which view is correct? The clear teaching of Scripture is that Jesus was impeccable, meaning Jesus could not have sinned. We are a part of the fellowship that is called the Assemblies of God. And our fellowship will approach the concept of impeccability primarily in relation to Jesus Christ, asserting that He was not only sinless in His life on earth, but also incapable of sinning due to His divine nature. This doctrine, known as Christ's impeccability, is distinct from the idea of sinlessness, which means the absence of actual sin. In other words, He was tempted, there was sin around Him, but because of His divine nature, He was unable to sin. If He could have sinned, He could still be able to sin today, because He retains the same essence He did while living on this earth. He is the God-man and will forever remain so, having full deity and full humanity, so united in one person as to be indivisible. To believe that Jesus could sin is to believe that God could sin, for God was pleased to have His fullness dwell in Jesus. For in Christ, all of the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form. Although Jesus is fully human, He was not born with the sinful nature that you and I are born with. He certainly was tempted in the same way that we are tempted, in that temptations was put before Him by Satan himself, yet He remained sinless because God is incapable of sinning. It is against His very nature to sin. Sin is, by definition, a trespass of the law. God created the law, and the law is by nature what God would or would not do. Therefore, sin is anything that God would not do by His very nature. I hope that makes sense to you right there. So to be tempted is not in and of itself sinful. A person could tempt you with something you have no desire to do, such as committing murder or participating in sexual perversions. You probably have no desire whatsoever to take part in these actions, but you were still tempted because someone placed the possibility before you. There are at least two definitions for the word tempted. One, to have a sinful proposition suggested to you by someone or something outside yourself or by your own sin nature. Two, consider actually participating in a sinful act and the possible pleasures and consequences of such an act to the degree that the act is already taking place in your mind. The first definition does not describe a sinful act or thought, the second does. The second scenario would be what Jesus said, when a man looks lustfully at a woman, he has committed adultery in his heart. That's the second nature there. So when you dwell upon the sinful act and consider how you might be able to bring it to pass, you have now crossed the line of sin. Jesus was tempted in the fashion of definition 1, except that he was never tempted by a sin nature because it never exists within him. In other words, Jesus never sat around thinking about how to sin, how it would work, working out a plan, never going through with it, but thinking about it. That never was inside of him because of his divine nature. Satan proposed certain sinful acts to Jesus, but he had no inner desire to participate in that sin. Therefore, he was tempted like we are, but remained sinless. Those who hold to peccability, meaning that Jesus could have sinned, believe that if Jesus could not have sinned, then he could not have truly experienced temptation, and therefore could not truly empathize with our struggle in temptation against sin. But we have to remember that one does not have to experience something in order to understand something. God knows everything about everything. While God has never had the desire to sin and has most definitely never sinned, God knows and understands what sin is. God knows and understands what it's like to be tempted. Jesus can empathize with our temptation because he knows, not because he has experienced all the same things we have. As with Christ's two natures, his two wills are not equally ultimate, but his human will was necessarily submissive to and reflective of his pre-existent divine will as the Son obeyed the Father on earth. So as a man, the incarnated Son necessarily expressed his inexhaustible purity as the second person of the Holy Trinity, including his infallible divine desire to pursue only what was holy and righteous and good, as he delighted in his Father's good will regarding his messianic mission. While additional qualifications may be offered for Christ's human obedience, the ultimate reason for his impeccability, the inability to sin, throughout his earthly life was the deity of his person as the incarnate mediator between us and God. As one theologian explains, will or intellect or emotion in the human nature could not have sinned unless the underlying person had fallen from a state of moral rectitude. In other words, the reason Jesus could not sin is because there was no fallen nature in him to want to sin, to have a desire to sin. In other words, the very act of the sin's incarnation ensured his lifelong impeccability from its inception. His Father was God. In assuming a human nature and all of its essential attributes, the divine Son lived, obeyed, and suffered as one whose human will was more like his human will was more like an organ of the eternal Son, assumed unchangeable, indivisible, and inseparable to himself as a member of the Godhead. Through Jesus' development in his finite mind and exercise his human will in perfect conformity to his divine personality, his humanity retained its creatural integrity throughout his earthly life. This means that the same Son who enjoyed perfect fellowship with his Father had to endure every ounce of every trial he faced as a true man in order to achieve our salvation, because it was almost like an organ that he lived in, if that makes sense. It's hard. I know it's hard, but the Bible is resolute in affirming that the divine Son was truly tempted in his humanity, making his triumph over sin and suffering all the more glorious. Jesus knows what it's like to be tempted, but he does not know what it's like to sin. This does not prevent him from assisting us. We are tempted with sins that are common to man. These sins generally can be boiled down to three types: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Examine the temptation and the sin of Eve in the garden as well as the temptation of Jesus, and you will find that the temptations for each form comes from these categories. So Jesus was tempted in every way and in every area that we are, but remained perfectly holy. Although our corrupt natures will have the inner desire to want to participate in some of these sins, we have the ability through Jesus to overcome sin, because we are no longer slaves to sin, but rather slaves unto God. So let's examine this through the Garden of Gethsemane. Obedience of Jesus Christ through his suffering. Think about it. One biblical evidence will suffice to prove the thoroughly voluntary quality of Christ's human obedience will highlight the misery of the temptations and illustrate how his human will flawlessly reflected his divine will as the Son in obedience to his Father. I believe this is a great illustration. Watch. Fully aware of the inexpressible pain and suffering that would attend his final acts of earthly obedience, Jesus faced his most intense trial of temptation in the Garden of Gethsemane. Luke describes it as agony, that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. The weight of impending judgment that would be undeservedly his was so horrendous that Jesus, the man, even pleaded for another way to fulfill this messianic mission. Mark recounts that he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. But he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me." This was not a moment of Trinitarian schizophrenia, with the divine Son wavering in his commitment to save, but was instead a sorrowful cry issuing from the heart, the human heart of Jesus. Facing this excruciating final demand of his holy mission, Christ displays the capacity to think and will as a man in distinction from his divine mind. As an innocent, holy man, Jesus wanted the cup removed. He did not want to face the wrath of God for sin. And yet, the impeccable nature, the inability to sin, the impeccable character of his human will impelled him to offer himself as a human sacrifice to the Father whenever he says, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Despite the disrupting thoughts of his immediate pain, the uncoerced human will of Christ, united to the eternal Son, cherished obedience to the Father above all else. And that is the picture. If you can study that picture, if you can understand that picture in the Garden of Gethsemane, is why Jesus could not have sinned. So in conclusion, there was the divine nature of who Jesus was, the Godhead inside of human form, was never going to allow him to be able to sin, because there was nothing inside of him that attracted him to sin. And so I hope that this has been educational for you, this theological exercise. It goes deep, it's a rabbit hole, and I probably didn't do the best job of trying to explain something this profound, but it is very fun for me to study these types of subjects. So thank you guys so very much for watching and studying with me. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. This is how we get the influence out there in our society today. So God bless you. We'll see you next time right here on the Revival Center YouTube page, The Influence.